What I'd like to do in this lecture is to talk a little bit about Soviet urban form. In your textbook, you get a more extensive history of this region, and what I'm going to talk about is basically the theories behind state socialism and how it played out in the Soviet Union in how they used space across the area. So one of the key ideas behind the Soviet Empire was state socialism. This is a form of economy and organization of society that's based on the principles of collective ownership and administration of the means of production and distributions of goods that's dominated and directed by the state. We can think about this in contrast to capitalism as we defined it, where individuals have the rights to private property and own the means of production. So in state socialism, the idea is that you have collective ownership of things like industries, services, and that in theory, the people would have a voice within their government to decide how to use these resources. How it was practiced in the Soviet Union didn't have a really representative democracy. Instead, you had an authoritarian system where the government was making decisions and directing how the economy and therefore society would be run and how this would play out across different spaces. Another theory that's important here is thinking about command economies. This is the idea of the whole national economy, all aspects of production and distribution as being centrally controlled by government agencies. And this was the idea behind the Soviet Empire. Within places like the United States, where capitalism is the dominant form of economic and social organization, you still have some socialist tendencies within things. There's ideas of things that are run by the government, such as the roads, the state parks, the police service, the postal service. So it's important to think about these things as not sort of one or the other, capitalist or socialist, but often the reality in practice is a gradation between these kind of two extremes of organizing society. And even within the Soviet Empire, there was a sort of underground free market that existed, but the major form of economic organization was socialism. One of the important things that helped define how the Soviets used space after World War II was the tremendous loss from fighting that war. So just to look at some of the statistics of the battles between the Soviet Union and the Germans on their Eastern Front, the Soviets lost 25 million people in that conflict. So a huge amount of human life lost. 1,700 towns and cities were destroyed, 84,000 villages lost, and 60% of all the industrial facilities within the Soviet Union destroyed by that conflict. So the Soviets were very interested in trying to create a buffer zone to protect them from future conflicts coming from Europe. So we heard about this a little when we read about Europe, but they had this zone of influence that then extended into what is present-day Europe, where you have trading relationships, also political alliances as well, and economic alliances, and kind of a protective zone. You also had the separation of Germany between two countries, East Germany and West Germany. East Germany under the sphere of Soviet influence, and the idea of this Iron Curtain that separated the Soviet sphere of influence from Western Europe. So some of the ways that the Soviets then planned their economy were things like territorial production complexes. These were places where they decided to manufacture a certain type of goods. You had, the government making a decision that this area is going to be where we're going to produce all of whatever this is, and all the infrastructure required to create it, all the people trained to do it are all going to live within this area. with the Soviet Union, you have multiple different republics and multiple different areas of specialization. But the idea was that there'd be interdependence between these different republics. Like capitalism, the goal of the Soviet socialist state was to industrialize and to develop it within the sense of sort of increasing overall wealth. The goal was to really speed industrialization, and in some ways this was very efficient. They had 10% growth by the 1950s and were really able to pull off some tremendous feats of industrialization, and for a long time, be on par with the United States in terms of innovation with things like the space race, weaponry in the Cold War, those types of things. Here's a map that shows some of the key manufacturing regions within present-day Russia, and some of these have sort of legacies of having been key manufacturing regions also within the Soviet Union. You can think about climate as a limiting variable. You'll notice that much of these complexes and many of the major cities within Russia are located in more southerly regions where the climate is a bit more forgiving and less cold overall. One of the features of the rural economy in the Soviet Union was an attempt to collectivize agriculture. So they basically relocated farmers to work on state-run collective farms. The people that resisted this, and many of them did, were sent to forced labor camps, imprisoned, or killed. Another aspect of the Soviet Empire was huge infrastructure projects that would try to transform nature for production. So you see a sort of commodification of nature even within sort of socialist systems. Many of these infrastructure projects led to huge environmental degradations because, again, the overall idea was not concerned with sustainability, but just increasing industrialization and getting as much out of a resource as one could. This map shows some of the major sites of mismanagement of environmental resources, pollution and degradation within the Soviet Union. So there was really, again, with this push for industrialization, not much effort to try to control pollution. So you see a lot of overuse of resources, things like deforestation. You have the sort of green revolution happening within the Soviet Union as well. And when I talk about that, I mean the green revolution in terms of applying industrialized agriculture to production throughout the world. So you have things like pesticides being used in huge amount, large-scale farm machinery, and that's led to a lot of soil erosion, water and air pollution, things like that. So you can see here on the map, places in the red are areas that have catastrophic environmental damage that is irreparable. And places in purple are areas of crisis proportion. Places that have the black squares are nuclear waste storage and disposal sites. Stars had nuclear atmospheric bomb testing. And then in the triangles, there's nuclear accident contamination areas. Another aspect of Soviet space is planning of cities. We had seen a little bit of urban form in places like Latin America and talked about things like walkability in the United States. But within the Soviet system, you have every aspect that's planned. So this was planned on the idea of creating an egalitarian society where you have everyone having sort of equal rights and access to things. In practice, how it played out, you see sort of very drab, or considered drab by folks in the West, and similar landscapes. So for example, in the images here, you see these apartment blocks where people, would have access to these apartments. They would all be very sort of similar in size. And in practice, there was still power differentiation in the Soviet system where people that had more power and control in the government still had access to better things. So the reality of it was that it wasn't really an egalitarian society. If we think about the Cold War, that's something that definitely looms large in folks from the United States. Is impressions of the Soviet Union. We have basically an ideological conflict between the Soviet Union and their sphere of influence, the United States, and Western Europe and their sphere of influence, sort of capitalism versus communism. And this played out in increasing innovation in industrial production, and also the industrial military complex on both sides of the war. So you see here an example of the amount of nuclear weapons that were accumulated by the United States and Russia over the course of the Cold War. So the United States had 9,400 total warheads. Russia had 13,000 total warheads. These are nuclear warheads that were created. The process of creating them obviously leads to environmental issues, and then also that these warheads, many of them are still out there and need to be secured. Some perhaps need to be decommissioned, those sorts of things. The Soviet Union was really the other world superpower during this time, and a threat and counter to U.S. hegemony. Though this didn't really break out into direct conflicts, there were a lot of different what's called proxy wars that took place, where the U.S. or the Soviet Union would back different sides of a conflict rather than fighting each other directly. So the conditions in 1990 and 1991, right leading up to the collapse, you see a sharp decline in agricultural and industrial production, and the economy really had a downturn overall, down 4% in 1990 and down 10 to 15% in the first half of 1991. There was also a real intensification of the ethno-cultural and nationalist differences between the different republics within the Soviet Union that really threatened the unity of the whole. And then also a kind of opening up of Soviet politics. So rather than the Communist Party having the strict monopoly or control over power, sort of more parties were given say in the political process, and there was a steady erosion of the Communist Party's power.